Why did the storm sound louder when she was alone? Rain hammered the corrugated roof like an angry percussion, each drop hitting sharp as shrapnel. Tess Calhoun sat in the dim glow of the shack's single lamp, listening not just to the storm, but to the silence it dragged in with it. The others had rolled out hours ago, tires carving their retreat into the mud, leaving behind grooves that looked more like wounds than tracks. They had left without a word, without even a glance back. Her fingers hovered above the battered radio set, where static hissed like a living thing. Then a voice cracked through, faint, distorted, broken by interference. Mayday, Foxtrot Echo 49er requesting immediate extraction, grid Delta 75. Low ammo, multiple hostiles. Her heart clenched. The voice belonged to Martinez, the same Martinez who had dismissed her at the briefing table, who had told her she wasn't needed, who had laughed when he called her motherboard, the one who fixed wires and stitched mesh but never fired a shot in anger. Now his life hung on the frequency he thought was worthless. She didn't answer, not yet. She let the storm eat his next syllables, her hand hovering, steady even as the rain dripped from her sleeve onto the metal desk. Her father had taught her, never panic, assess, calibrate, deliver. She closed her eyes for a moment, measuring not just the words she'd heard, but the weight behind them. Abandonment still pressed heavy on her chest, like wet canvas refusing to dry. Betrayal wasn't an open wound. It was a slow ache that taught you to breathe differently. When she opened her eyes, the decision was already made. She stood slowly, shoulders rising as if the weight of every slight, every dismissal, slid down her back. The operations tent had been stripped, but the careless always left something behind. Spare kits, dented helmets, broken headsets, enough for someone like her to make a plan. She found the pinned map sleeve under a tipped coffee thermos. Delta 75, deep in the floodplain, reckless. No one set up there unless they'd been driven. She traced the coordinates with her fingertip. Martinez and his squad were cornered. She zipped her field pack, medical kit, thermal blanket, spare charge cells, emergency beacon, sidearm. It wasn't enough, but it would have to be. She paused only once, thumb brushing across the rusted dog tags hanging from the corner of her pack, her father's. She whispered to herself the words she always said when fear threatened to speak louder than resolve. I got this. 15 minutes into the descent, the terrain turned on her. Mud slicked from beneath her boots, roots clawing her ankles like warning fingers. The rain didn't relent. Still, she moved with a rhythm most had never noticed. The same rhythm that made her hands steady when stitching broken circuits or when rerouting signals through fried comm relays. They hadn't seen her practice simulations in her head during barrack silence. They hadn't noticed that she always had the right tool before anyone asked. They hadn't seen her capacity for survival because they hadn't looked. Once Martinez had smirked, called her motherboard in front of the others. They laughed. She remembered not the joke but the disdain. The way her worth had been measured in spare parts, not instincts. Now motherboard was coming to clean up their mess. By the time she reached the tree line bordering grid Delta 75, dusk had bruised the sky purple and black. Then she heard it. Gunfire. Too far to see, too close to ignore. Her breath slowed. Her hand unholstered the sidearm. She moved like shadow, storm-slick and deliberate. Through the underbrush she saw them, Martinez and the others, clustered behind a half-crushed rover. 4 figures back to back, one shouting into a radio, one bleeding, another firing wildly, none of them looking where they should. She counted 3 hostiles flanking from the ridge, sloppy ambush, no suppressing fire, no warning systems deployed, idiots. She raised her weapon, exhaled once and pulled the trigger. 1 hostile dropped, adjusted, 2. The third spun toward her too late, 3. By the time Martinez turned, eyes wide, she was already moving toward them. He blinked like she was a mirage conjured by panic. Calhoun, you came. Her voice was flat, stripped of emotion. You called for help. No more words wasted. She moved between them with precision, bandages pressed into a bleeding side, tourniquet tied without hesitation, ammunition redistributed, hands steady, movements surgical. She reloaded one man's rifle without his asking, shoved it back into his hands. She didn't curse, didn't shout, didn't falter, because trembling meant doubt, and doubt meant failure. She didn't have that luxury. The firefight stretched into minutes that felt like hours, but when the last echo faded and their extraction bird churned the storm overhead, they were alive. Alive because of her. They staggered into the chopper, drenched, bruised, silent. The rotor blades screamed above them. Martinez finally broke the quiet. "Why'd you come?" She didn't look at him, didn't let him hear the bitterness in her chest. "Because you forgot the one person who listens to the emergency channel." No one spoke again. No one called her motherboard again. Tess didn't wait for thanks. She stepped off the vac chopper before the blade slowed, boots striking the tarmac with a force that reverberated in her ribs. Rain followed her, clinging to her hair, dripping down her lashes. The base lights shimmered off wet concrete, overhead bulbs humming like they knew her secret. Martinez hadn't met her eyes since. None of them had. Silence wrapped her again, but this time it was different. Silence was no stranger. Silence was where she thrived. She walked past the debriefing tent, ignoring the medics who called after her. The welt along her ribs, the gash at her shoulder, the ankle she could barely bend, none of it mattered. What burned inside her mattered more. She had saved them, and they would bury it like they always buried what didn't fit neatly into their reports. The hum of the comms room embraced her like a sanctuary. Screens flickered with incoming drone feeds, thermal scans, stray bursts of chatter. She slid into the chair, eyes drawn to the evac coordinates still glowing faintly on the map overlay. She traced her path with the edge of a stylus, then zoomed out. They shouldn't have been there. And if the terrain had swallowed them whole, command would have stamped it hostile loss and moved on. But she hadn't. Her gaze shifted to another screen, outgoing emergency broadcasts. Her brows drew together. The request hadn't come through the squad's open channel. It had routed directly to her terminal. Her pulse ticked once sharp. Why her, why that line? Hours later, she stood outside Lieutenant Ross's office. Ross wasn't a soldier by blood. He was a corporate transfer, a security consultant turned field advisor, harmless on the surface. Tess knew better. "Enter." She stepped inside. He didn't look up from his glowing screen. "Didn't expect to see you, Calhoun. Not your rotation." "I need access to the audit logs." Now he looked up. "Why?" "The distress call. It was routed directly to my console, not the general channel." Ross leaned back. "Could have been a glitch." Tess's jaw tightened, her voice dropped. "We don't glitch that cleanly." Silence stretched. He studied her, calculating. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" Her eyes held his, calm, sharp. "I never do." The audit logs told a story no one wanted told. The emergency beacon had pinged before Martinez's team had even left base, which meant the call she'd heard wasn't theirs. It was planted. A breadcrumb. A test. But why and why her? Later that night she stood in the barracks staring at an empty bunk. Renshaw, supply tech, quiet, always watching but never looking anyone in the eye. He had clocked in near the shack 30 minutes before the beacon activated. Now his gear was gone. His file stamped temporary reassignment, no action required. Like he had never existed. Tess gripped the bunk rail until her knuckles ached. This wasn't abandonment, this wasn't chance. She hadn't saved them from recklessness. She had walked into a test, one someone had engineered, one someone had watched. And she had passed. But the man who knew why had vanished. And no one called her motherboard again. Tess didn't wait for thanks. She stepped off the vac chopper before the blades had even slowed, boots slamming against wet tarmac with a hollow weight that traveled up her spine. The rain had followed her all the way back, clinging to her hair, dripping across her lashes, crawling down her jacket like a stubborn insult that refused to be shaken. Base lights buzzed overhead, each bulb humming like an accusation, as though the whole compound knew what she had just done, what she had just uncovered. Martinez hadn't met her eyes, neither had anyone else. Silence gathered around her again, but silence wasn't new. It was where she lived, where she worked best. She strode past the debriefing tent, ignoring the medics who shouted after her. The grazed shoulder, the bruised ribs, the swollen ankle, injuries she should have treated would wait. What burned inside her mattered more. She had saved them. Again. And already she could feel their silence erasing it, folding her actions into the blank spaces of a report, burying her worth like a classified file no one dared sign. She entered the comms room, and the hum of machines wrapped around her like a strange kind of comfort. Screens glowed with live feeds, drones drifting across broken floodplains, thermal pings from distant patrols, stray bursts of coded chatter. She slid into the central chair. Her eyes landed on the evac coordinates still glowing faintly on the overlay map. Her hand traced the line she had taken to reach them, a path too deliberate, too exact. They should never have been stationed there. If they had been lost to the terrain, command would have stamped it hostile loss and moved on. But she hadn't. She had answered. And then her gaze snagged on another screen, a log of outgoing emergency broadcasts. Her pulse skipped once. The request hadn't come through the squad's open channel. It had been routed directly to her console. Only hers. Her breath caught. That wasn't chance. That wasn't a glitch. It was intent. Hours later, bruised and unshowered, she stood outside Lieutenant Ross's office. Ross had a reputation, not born military but transferred from corporate security, a man who had never seen combat but carried authority like a currency. People dismissed him. Tess didn't. She had seen the careful way he listened in meetings, the subtle pauses when questions hit too close, the way he smiled as if everything already belonged to him. She knocked. Enter. The office smelled faintly of recycled air and coffee gone cold. Ross didn't look up as she stepped in. His eyes stayed locked on the glow of his monitor. "Didn't expect to see you, Calhoun," he said. His voice was smooth, flat. "Not your rotation." "I need access to the audit logs," she said. Now he looked at her, a pause, a flicker in his eyes. "Why?" "The distress call from last night's operation. It was routed directly to my console, not the general channel." Ross leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. Could have been a glitch. Tess's jaw clenched, her voice dropped sharp and certain. "We don't glitch that cleanly." Silence stretched. The hum of the machine seemed louder. Finally, Ross sighed as though he were indulging a child's persistence. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" Her stare didn't waver. "I never do." The audit logs told the truth. The emergency beacon had pinged before Martinez's team had ever left the base, which meant the call she received wasn't theirs. It had been planted. Engineered. A breadcrumb dropped in front of her. But why and why her? 3 hours later, she stood in the barracks, one hand gripping the rail of an empty bunk. Renshaw's bunk. Private Renshaw, supply tech, quiet, always watching but never meeting anyone's gaze. He had clocked in near the comms shack 30 minutes before the beacon had activated. Now he was gone, his gear stripped, his bunk cleared, his file marked with a single cold line, temporary reassignment, no action required. It was too clean, too precise, too deliberate. She stared at those words until they burned into her mind like they'd been carved with a blade. This wasn't abandonment. This wasn't recklessness. This was design. She hadn't saved them from their own failure. She had walked into something else. A test. Someone had watched her every move. Someone had wanted to see if she would answer, if she would succeed where she was supposed to fail. And she had passed. But the man who could explain it was already gone. Sleep evaded her that night. She sat cross-legged on her bunk, the dim light from a wall fixture spilling across her face. Questions played in her head like a drumbeat she couldn't silence. Why route the call to her? Why plant the beacon before the mission even began? Why Renshaw? And most of all, who was watching? By the next morning, she wasn't at her assigned station. Instead, she slipped into the underused server bay at the back of the compound. The room smelled of dust and stale electricity, rows of outdated terminals humming faintly like old ghosts. No one questioned her presence there. Technicians always looked busy, and Tess had learned long ago how to disappear in plain sight. While others thought she was running diagnostics, she was already 3 layers deep into packet logs, pinging ghost devices, chasing threads of code most operators didn't even know existed. She found it by accident, or maybe by instinct. A buried directory, time-stamped exactly 4 minutes before Renshaw's last logged entry. It was locked with encryption. She cracked it in less than 3. Inside was a string of surveillance logs from her own perspective. Helmet cam angles, radio relay feedback, thermal overlays, all stitched into a single high-resolution playback file. Her name stamped across the header. Subject CALHOUN, Field Behavioral Response Sim, Test Cycle 6. Her mouth went dry. Test cycle. Which meant there had been others. How many times had she been watched, observed, measured not by her actions but by her reactions? Her chest tightened as she scrolled through the files, each one a window into moments she thought had belonged only to her. The night she rerouted the squad's comms by hand during a blackout. The day she bandaged a wound in silence while others argued. The way she slipped through rain like it didn't slow her. They hadn't just been watching, they had been cataloging. For how long, and for what purpose? She closed the file, leaned back in the chair, and stared at the flickering ceiling light. Her father's words surfaced again, unbidden. Trust the mission, not the people. Her mother's voice layered over it. Just because they need you doesn't mean they'll protect you. And Tess realized both of them had been right. 2 nights later, the envelope appeared. No name, no stamp, just a single folded sheet of paper waiting on her cot. Midnight North Fence, come alone. She arrived at 23:59. The North Fence was a known blind spot, cameras dead for years, a glitch the brass never cared to fix. For 12 long minutes she waited. Rain slicked against the chain link. Generators droned in the distance, buzzing like flies around a wound. Then a figure stepped from the shadows. Older civilian clothes, military posture, a faint scar across his brow. You found the logs, he said. Tess didn't nod, didn't speak. They weren't supposed to root to you, he continued, but they did. He smiled faintly, which is why you're still alive. Her voice was quiet, razor-sharp. Who are you? The man glanced past her, as if checking the dark for listeners. Call me Whitlock. I used to be in your shoes, until I saw what they were really doing. She held her ground. What are they doing? Whitlock's eyes glinted in the weak light. Running games, setting traps, watching who survives. Your squad wasn't the target, Calhoun, you were. Her breath hitched, but her face stayed stone. The evac call wasn't theirs. The opposition wasn't either. It was staged, automated. You didn't just pass Tess, you exceeded parameters. Whitlock held up a small drive between 2 fingers. You want the rest of it. Her hand hovered, but she didn't take it. Why give it to me? His expression softened, but only slightly. Because I was you 10 years ago, and I walked away before they put me in a cage I couldn't break. Now I want to see what someone like you does with the truth. The drive gleamed faintly under the fence light, and Tess realized something chilling. Whatever choice she made tonight, Someone else was already watching. For people like you. The words lingered in the air between them, heavier than the rain-soaked fence, heavier than the silence pressing against her ribs. Tess didn't flinch. She let them sit, let the meaning settle like dust that refused to be brushed aside. For people like me, she repeated, voice flat. Whitlock nodded. Operators they can't predict, too quiet, too adaptable. You never fail a drill, but you never raise a flag either. You don't fit their models, Calhoun, and that makes you dangerous. Her jaw tightened. So they run games, stage ambushes, send a whole squad into a floodplain just to see what I'll do. Your squad wasn't the target, Whitlock said. You were. The rain hissed harder against the chain link. Tess felt it seep cold through her jacket, but she didn't move. The evac call wasn't theirs, he continued. The opposition wasn't either. That firefight was staged, automated test cells, tracked, measured, analyzed. They wanted to see not if you survived, but how. Her throat was dry, and I exceeded parameters. Whitlock smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. You didn't just pass, Tess. You proved you're more valuable than they thought. He held up the drive again. Its casing gleamed silver under the floodlight, small enough to vanish into a pocket, heavy enough to sink a conscience. You want the rest of it, take it. She hesitated. Every instinct told her not to, that whatever was inside would rewrite the quiet truths she had built her life around. But another voice, the one that had carried her through storm and betrayal, told her that turning away would mean living blind. Her hand closed around the drive, cold metal against warmer skin. Why give it to me? She asked again. Because I was you, Whitlock said softly, and I walked away before they caged me. I want to see what you do with the truth. The words echoed long after he disappeared into the dark. Back in the server bay, Tess sat alone beneath the flickering hum of outdated machines. She slid the drive into an isolated port, shielding it from the main network. Layers of encryption unraveled beneath her steady hands. 6 locks, 6 codes, each one watermarked with a different call sign, none traceable. At last the files opened, and what she saw hollowed her chest. Dozens of folders, surveillance logs, simulation scripts, psychological overlays, each labeled with cold precision: Test Cycle 1, Cycle 2, Cycle 3. Her name stamped across every header. Not just her, others too. Soldiers she knew by face if not by name, quiet operators, misfits, the ones who didn't quite belong. Every file told the same story. Engineered scenarios designed not to test skill but to measure reaction. Behavior under stress, decision-making under impossible odds. Not training, not drills, conditioning. Weaponization. She clicked one file at random. It played back a feed from her own perspective, her helmet cam during the firefight at Delta 75. Every movement cataloged, every shot measured, her hands binding a wound, her silence in chaos, annotated with clinical notes. Subject response, CALHOUN. Confidence threshold exceeded. Emotional suppression, optimal. Loyalty markers, inconclusive. Recommended, further evaluation. Her stomach turned. She scrolled faster, file after file, not just her missions, not just her choices, even moments she hadn't thought anyone was watching, sitting in the barracks at night, staring at her father's dog tags, running silent simulations in her head, fixing comm relays alone in the dark. Every detail cataloged, every breath scored. She leaned back, pressing her palms into her eyes until stars bloomed behind the lids. They hadn't just trained her, they had shaped her, studied her like a lab rat running mazes she hadn't known existed. And they weren't finished. One file stood out, a folder buried deeper, timestamped to the night of the evac call. She opened it. The header glared at her. Subject CALHOUN, Field Behavioral Response Sim, Test Cycle 6. Test Cycle. Her hand hovered over the mouse. If there had been 6 cycles, how many had she missed? How many times had she been placed in danger not for mission's sake, but for data? She exhaled, slow and measured. Her father's voice again: never panic, assess, calibrate, deliver. But this wasn't calibration. This was entrapment. The next morning, Tess stood at the edge of the training yard, rain-soaked dirt beneath her boots. The others moved through drills, shouting, laughing, grunting through physical strain. No one looked at her. No one asked why her eyes were darker than usual, or why her silence felt heavier. But one thought beat louder than the rain. If she was cycle 6, then what happened to 1 through 5? That night she dug deeper into the drive. More files, more surveillance, more anomalies, until she found it, a directory mislabeled, almost too obvious. Behavioral Conditioning Initiative Tier 4. Her stomach dropped as she opened it. Dozens of names, soldiers across multiple bases, each one tagged with outcomes: failed, reassigned, disappeared, a handful marked successful. Her name: successful. The cold clarity of it struck harder than any storm. She was a product, not just of her training, not just of her survival, but of a system designed to mold, test, and discard. She snapped the drive closed, slid it into her pocket, and sat back in the dark. Her mother's words again: just because they need you doesn't mean they'll protect you. Her father's warning layered over it: trust the mission, not the people. She had done both, and they had turned her into a test subject. By the third night, exhaustion dragged at her, but sleep never came. She paced the length of her quarters until the shadows blurred. Then she saw it. An envelope, plain, manila, waiting on her cot like it had always been there. No name, no stamp. Inside, a single line typed on a folded sheet: Midnight North Fence, come alone. Her pulse ticked. Once, twice. She folded the paper, slid it into her pocket, and sat in the silence until the clock struck 23:50. At 23:59 she arrived. Rain slicked against the chain link, the hum of generators buzzing in the distance. And for 12 minutes, nothing. Only the sound of her breath, steady, controlled. Then Whitlock stepped from the shadows. "You found the logs," he said. Tess's hand brushed the pocket where the drive burned cold against her thigh. She didn't nod, didn't answer. "They weren't supposed to root to you," Whitlock said. "Yet they did." He smiled faintly. "Which means you're still alive for now." Her voice was a whisper sharpened into steel. "Why me?" Whitlock's gaze was steady. "Because you're the one thing they can't program: choice, and that terrifies them." His words cut deeper than she wanted to admit. The storm pressed in, the fence rattled in the wind, and Tess realized the truth. She wasn't just part of the mission. She was the mission. It didn't sit right. Not the silence, not the conveniently stripped bunk, not the way Renshaw's name vanished from lips and logs as though he had never drawn breath. Tess wasn't paranoid. She was precise. She believed in systems, in patterns, in the quiet truths hidden beneath data trails. That was what made her valuable. That was what made her dangerous. And now, that was what made her a threat. Because she couldn't shake the feeling. Someone had been watching her, not just during the floodplain mission, not just during the firefight, but always. Every reaction, every decision cataloged. Not for a report, not for training, for something larger. By midweek, she had abandoned her usual post at the comms desk. Instead, she sat tucked in the far corner of the base's underused server bay, cloaked by the low hum of obsolete machines. No one asked why. To the others, she was just another technician knee-deep in diagnostics. To Tess, it was cover. She sifted packet logs, mapped stray pings, pulled at ghost code buried under layers of bureaucracy. She chased anomalies most operators didn't even know existed, and finally she found it. A buried directory, password locked, time-stamped 4 minutes before Renshaw's last logged entry. Her pulse slowed, Her fingers moved with clinical steadiness. She cracked the lock in under 3 minutes. Inside surveillance logs her own perspective. Helmet cam, radio relay, thermal overlay, all stitched into seamless playback, high resolution, labeled in block letters. Subject CLHOUN. Field Behavioral Response SIM. Test Cycle 6. Her breath caught. Cycle 6, which meant there had been others. Her stomach twisted. How long had she been under observation? How many times had she been pushed, her choices manipulated to feed someone else's metric? She forced herself to watch. Her image moved across the screen, rain soaking her uniform, eyes unflinching, hands steady. She saw herself patch wounds, redistribute ammo, move with precision. Every action annotated with sterile commentary. Confidence threshold, exceeded. Loyalty markers, inconclusive. Emotional suppression, optimal. The words stung like acid. She wasn't a soldier in their eyes. She was data. She slammed the terminal closed, chest heaving. Silence swallowed her, heavy, suffocating. That night, her mother's voice haunted her. Just because they need you doesn't mean they'll protect you. Her father's words joined it. Trust the mission, not the people. And she understood now. They had both been warnings. Warnings she hadn't seen until it was too late. On the third night, the envelope appeared, plain manila, waiting on her cot like a quiet threat. She unfolded it with steady hands. Midnight North Fence, come alone. Her instincts screamed trap, but her curiosity, the same force that had driven her to trace pings and decrypt ghost logs, was louder. She arrived at 23:59. The North Fence was a blind spot. Cameras glitched there years ago. A gap command had never bothered to seal. Rain slicked the chain link. Generators droned in the distance, buzzing like flies over carrion. She waited 12 minutes. Stillness pressed in. Then a figure stepped from the shadows. Older, civilian clothes, military posture, scar across his brow. "You found the logs," he said. She didn't nod, didn't speak. "They weren't supposed to root to you," he continued, "but they did." He smiled faintly, "Which means you're still alive." Her voice was sharp, quiet. "Who are you?" "Call me Whitlock," he said. "I used to be in your shoes until I saw what they were really doing." "And what are they doing?" Whitlock's eyes flicked across the dark as if measuring shadows. "Running tests, engineering pressure points, watching who breaks and who doesn't. Your squad wasn't the target, Calhoun. You were. Every move you made in that floodplain was staged. The evac call, the hostiles, all of it." Her breath slowed. "Why me?" "Because you're unpredictable," he said. "Too quiet, too adaptable. They can't model you cleanly, and that scares them, so they test you, measure you, shape you." Her pulse ticked, 1, 2. "And you passed. More than that, you exceeded parameters." From his pocket he pulled a small drive, silver casing, ordinary to the eye but heavier than truth itself. "You want the rest of it, take it." Her hand didn't move. "Why give it to me?" Whitlock's expression softened, but only slightly. "Because I was you 10 years ago, and I walked away before they locked me in. I want to see what someone like you does with the truth." The drive glinted under the fence light. Tess felt its weight before she even touched it. Cold metal, warmer skin. She pocketed it. When she looked up again, Whitlock was already gone. Alone in the rain, Tess whispered the words she hadn't dared until now. "I'm not just part of the mission, I am the mission." The drive burned against her thigh, as if it knew she was right. She spent the next night beneath the old radar dish, a forgotten relic at the edge of the compound. It was the one place no one checked, because no one believed it still worked. She slid the drive into an isolated terminal, hands steady. 6 layers of encryption. She cracked them all. The files unfolded in front of her. Dozens of operations, not just hers. Soldiers across bases, each targeted for reasons that made cruel sense. Too adaptable, too silent, too different. People who didn't fit molds, people who couldn't be programmed. Some passed, some failed, some disappeared. Her chest tightened as she read the header stamped across every line. Behavioral Conditioning Initiative, Tier 4. Crisis Adaptation Protocol. But this wasn't training. This was profiling. Weaponization. She leaned back, fists pressed to her temples. They weren't just creating soldiers. They were creating weapons disguised as people, and she was one of them. Her reflection stared back at her from the black corner of the screen, eyes hollow, jaw tight. She whispered, "What did you make me into?" The answer came not from the terminal but from her memory, Whitlock's voice. "You're the one thing they can't program, choice." The word echoed inside her like a lifeline. Choice. She still had it. For now. 2 mornings later, Tess stood outside the weapons cage. The quartermaster, a grizzled veteran with one eye clouded by time, eyed her paperwork. "Big move," he muttered. "Not my call," Tess said, strapping on a tack rig with a calm she didn't feel. He handed her a sidearm, polished, heavier than what she usually carried. "Good luck." She looked him in the eye. "I make my own." At the regional center, everything was sterile. Glass panels, uniforms too clean, faces that didn't blink often enough. They made her wait, 83 minutes in a soundproofed room. Then 4 people entered, 3 civilians, 1 military liaison. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't need to. "Staff Specialist Calhoun," the woman in the center said, "you've been flagged for reassignment to tier operations. Do you accept this elevation?" Tess's face was unreadable. "What's the mission profile?" A man slid a folder across the table. She opened it. Inside was a single photograph. A woman, early 40s, hardened gaze, scar across her brow. The caption read, "Asset GHOSTFIRE, status, rogue, objective, neutralize." Tess's chest went cold. She knew the face. Whitlock. Or the one Whitlock had been protecting. Ghostfire. The woman who had built the early protocols. The one who had walked away when she saw what tier was becoming. And now they wanted Tess to bring her in. She set the folder down, face still neutral. "I need 24 hours. The panel exchanged glances. The woman tilted her head. "To prepare." Tess nodded once. They agreed. But Tess had no intention of returning. She left the center with the folder under her arm, sidearm strapped tight, resolve sharper than it had ever been. Everything had changed. They weren't just watching her, they were choosing her. Not for merit, not for valor, but for usefulness. And now they expected her to betray the only person who had told her the truth. She reached the shuttle depot, then ducked down a maintenance corridor. By the time they realized she had missed transport, Tess Calhoun was already 15 miles away. And not alone. Whitlock was waiting. Steam rose from the thermos in his hands, calm as though this had been the plan all along. She dropped the folder onto the table between them. "They want me to hunt her," she said. Whitlock didn't ask who, he already knew. "She trained me," he said quietly, "before they scrubbed her from the files. She helped write the protocols. And when she saw what they were turning it into, she went dark." Tess leaned back against the wall. "So what happens now?" Whitlock's eyes met hers. "Now you decide what you really are." Tess had no intention of returning. She walked out of the regional center with the folder tucked under her arm, the sidearm strapped tight against her hip, and her pulse beating with clarity. They hadn't chosen her for valor. They hadn't chosen her for merit. They had chosen her because she was useful, because she was unpredictable enough to pass their tests and quiet enough to survive them. And now they wanted her to betray the one person who had told her the truth. She reached the shuttle depot, boots echoing across the sterile floor. At the last second she veered left, slipping down a maintenance corridor the others never noticed. By the time the transport lifted, she was gone, 15 miles away and moving fast. Not alone. Whitlock waited in the abandoned relay station, steam curling from the thermos he cradled in both hands. He looked calm, as though this had been inevitable. Tess dropped the folder on the table between them. They want me to hunt her. Whitlock didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the folder. I know. She trained me, he said after a long pause. His voice softened, not with pity but with memory. Before they scrubbed her name from the files, before they called her rogue, she helped build the early protocols, wrote the predictive threat index, and when she saw what they were turning it into. She went dark, Tess finished. Whitlock nodded. They've tried to bring her back, sent teams, none returned. Tess leaned against the cold wall, arms crossed. So what happens now? Whitlock's eyes met hers, steady, unyielding. Now you decide what you really are. The next morning, Tess cracked the folder open again. The woman's photo stared back at her. Early 40s, hardened gaze, scar above her brow, the name stamped in black ink, Ghostfire. She wasn't listed as a deserter, not labeled as missing. Tyr had marked her rogue. That word carried weight. Not just someone who left, but someone who refused silence. Someone who became a liability because she remembered too much. Tess read through the file, skimming every line. Ghostfire's warnings had been buried under jargon, smeared with bureaucratic ink. Her research reclassified, her intentions rewritten. And yet beneath the camouflage, a pattern emerged. Ghostfire hadn't vanished entirely. She had left breadcrumbs, server backdoors, corrupted files, encrypted signatures hidden in chatter no one bothered to decrypt. One name recurred, a strange one. Lux Vector 6. At first Tess thought it was a code, a project designation maybe, but the way Ghostfire had scrawled it by hand in a margin, as though it meant something more, unsettled her. She whispered the words aloud, Lux Vector 6. What was it? Who was it? By the fifth night, she had pieced together enough fragments to map a trail. Ghostfire had been careful, but she hadn't been silent. Her trail pointed toward the abandoned observatory complex in the northern desert, a forgotten node Tyr had written off as obsolete. Tess knew better. If Ghostfire wanted her to find Lux, that was where the truth would begin. The journey was brutal. She moved under false IDs, stole a snowrunner from a depot 3 towns over, and rode it through mountain passes where the wind bit like knives. She stopped only to refuel, to eat, to breathe. Each mile carried her further from Tyr's reach, and deeper into the shadow of the truth she wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. By dawn on the third day, she reached the edge of the desert. The observatory rose from the basin like a skeleton, its dome fractured, its walls carved by time. No drones circled above. No sentries patrolled the perimeter. Tyr hadn't been here in years. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and damp memory. She found the terminal exactly where the logs had said it would be, buried beneath a rusted crate, forgotten but not dead. She powered it on. The screen flickered blue. Vector 6 recognized. Tess froze. Recognized, not requested, not questioned, recognized. The terminal pulsed once, then a prompt appeared. Enter code. Her breath quickened. She typed slowly, almost without thinking, CALHOUN Protocol 47. A pause. Then access granted. Lines of code spilled across the screen, flooding faster than she could track. Logs, maps, operation names she had never heard, and then one line flashed in the corner. Incoming transmission, AUTHNTICATD source. The window opened. A face appeared. Older now but unmistakable, hollow-eyed, scarred, not broken. Ghostfire. Tess Calhoun, the woman said, her voice like gravel softened by memory. You weren't supposed to find this place so fast. You left the trail, Tess said evenly. Ghostfire almost smiled. You're not what they expected. Tess leaned forward, her reflection fractured in the screen. Tell me who Lux is. Ghostfire paused. Shadows deepened the lines of her face. Then she spoke, words measured, heavy. Lux Vector 6 is you. The silence that followed cracked through Tess like a lightning bolt. Her throat closed, her chest tightened, she shook her head once. You're lying. Ghostfire's gaze didn't waver. I wish I were. Lux Vector isn't a name, Ghostfire continued. It's a contingency designation for candidates born with the right blend of traits: cognitive adaptability, observational retention, autonomous reasoning under duress. A prototype program. You were the first viable candidate. Tess felt her breath stumble. I didn't enroll in any tier program until... You didn't have to, Ghostfire cut in. You were enrolled the moment your father signed the department's behavioral waiver on your medical file, when you were 10. Her fists clenched. That was for neurotherapy, post-incident trauma review. Ghostfire nodded, which was how they embedded the first layer of conditioning. The words hollowed her. She wasn't just trained, she was engineered. Her voice was almost a whisper. Why now? Why the tests? Why the evac call through my frequency? Ghostfire's eyes flickered. Because your markers finally passed the internal threshold. Tier sees you as operational. They've already tagged you for black directive work. Tess went cold. Black directives weren't rumors, they were nightmares. Missions stripped from accountability. Quiet terminations. Targets erased not because of evidence but because of prediction. Predictive nullification. Her voice caught. They want to use me to erase people before they act. Ghostfire's gaze softened, but only slightly. I needed you to see this before they buried what's left of your autonomy, before you became the weapon they designed. Tess stared at her reflection in the monitor's dark corners. Her own face fractured, multiplied, unrecognizable. I don't want to be a ghost, she whispered. Then don't, Ghostfire said simply. Come with me. They met 2 days later, in the ruins of a research facility on the continent's fringe. Tess climbed through a collapsed elevator shaft, ribs aching with every breath, until she found Ghostfire waiting in the server vault below. Arms crossed, pulse rifle slung low. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Ghostfire said, There's a third name in your file, one buried deeper than mine. Tess stiffened. A third what? Candidate, Ghostfire said. A failed Lux protocol. They buried her after a mission went wrong, but she didn't die. She vanished. Tess's pulse quickened. And you think she's still out there? Ghostfire nodded once. And if she is, she's the only one who can help us dismantle the framework that made you. Tess's voice was quiet. What's her designation? Ghostfire pulled a rusted drive from her coat, placed it on the table between them. Subject Lux Vector 1, status obscured. Tess reached for the drive. It was colder than the desert night, heavier than steel. Vector 1, the original, the failed test. Or maybe the one who got away. The drive was colder than steel. Tess turned it in her palm, the surface scarred, worn from years of being hidden. Ghostfire's eyes never left her face. You already know what this means, Ghostfire said. Tess shook her head once. I know what they'll say it means. Failed candidate, discarded file, another ghost buried in paperwork. Ghostfire's voice was low, steady. Or the only proof you aren't alone. The words cracked something inside her. For weeks, no, for years, Tess had carried her silence like armor. Alone in the barracks, alone in the field, alone even when her squad laughed at her expense. Loneliness had been her shield. Now Ghostfire was telling her there might be someone else. Someone who understood. Someone who had walked the same invisible maze. Vector 1, Tess whispered, the name tasting strange on her tongue. Ghostfire nodded. The first prototype. The blueprint they built the rest of us from. She failed their metrics, but failure isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's survival. Tess's grip tightened on the drive. Where do we start? They began with fragments. The drive was layered in old code, the kind no modern parser could untangle cleanly. Tess worked in silence, fingers steady, Ghostfire packing the shadows of the server vault. Every so often, Tess caught the older woman glancing at her, watchful, protective, as if waiting for her to crack. But Tess didn't crack. She peeled away encryption like old bandages, exposing scars beneath. Coordinates emerged, scrambled reports, radio snippets flagged inconclusive, and one half-buried line that froze them both. Subject Vector 1 cited Northern Corridor Outpost, status unconfirmed. Ghostfire exhaled through her teeth. That was 3 years ago. Still a trail, Tess said. Ghostfire tilted her head. You sound certain. I've lived my whole life following signals no one else hears, Tess said softly. She left one. I'll find it. The Northern Corridor was not a place people visited willingly. Snow choked its valleys, wind cut flesh from bone, and the outpost itself was little more than a husk left behind after the war. But if Vector 1 had been there, Tess needed to see it. They moved under the cover of false manifests, stealing a transport designed for weather drones. For 2 days, they flew through endless storms, silence filling the space between them. On the 3rd night, the outpost appeared, a black scar against white wasteland. Inside, the air was brittle with cold. Corridors stretched like veins, empty but not abandoned. Tess's boots echoed off steel. Every corner hummed with ghosts. They searched in silence. Old bunks, scorched consoles, records half burned, half frozen. Then Tess found it, scratched into the underside of a bunk rail, almost invisible. 3 words. Don't trust THEM. Her throat tightened. Vector 1, Ghostfire murmured. Tess traced the letters with her fingertips. They weren't neat. They were carved desperate, each stroke pressed hard enough to split metal. She was here, Tess said. Ghostfire's face hardened, and she knew what you know now. That night Tess couldn't sleep. She sat alone in the command deck, the stars outside fractured by storm clouds. Her mind churned. Vector 1 wasn't dead. She had survived long enough to carve warnings into steel, which meant she had run, which meant she might still be running. But if Tyr hadn't found her by now, it wasn't luck, it was design. Which begged the question, had Vector 1 gone dark on purpose? Or had she been hiding from people like Tess and Ghostfire as much as from Tyr itself? The thought cut deep. Because what if the person she was chasing didn't want to be found? They traced another fragment 3 days later, buried in a corrupted comm log. A burst of chatter intercepted at the edge of the corridor. A voice too garbled to identify. A single phrase that survived the distortion. Not another weapon. Ghostfire leaned over Tess's shoulder, her breath clouding in the frozen air. That's her. Tess's pulse quickened. How can you be sure? Because it's the same thing I told myself when I walked away. The message was untraceable. No coordinates, no metadata, just a voice carried by storm winds lost in static. But it was enough to remind Tess, Vector 1 wasn't a ghost, not yet. And then came the silence. No more leads, no more fragments, just absence. For a week, Tess and Ghostfire camped in the frozen ruin, their breaths frosting in the dark, their words fewer each night. The stillness weighed heavier than combat. Until the 7th morning. Tess woke to an empty bunk. Ghostfire was gone. Her chest tightened. She searched every corridor, every shadow, every frostbitten corner. Nothing, no note, no trace. Only the drive, placed neatly on her cot, as if Ghostfire had never existed. Inside, one line of text glowed across the terminal. Trust yourself, not me. Tess stood in the silence, her breath ragged in the cold. For the first time, she felt the weight of true abandonment again. But this time, it wasn't betrayal. It was something sharper. A test. And she hated herself for recognizing it. By dusk, she sat on the outpost roof, snow piling against her boots, stars flickering faint beyond storm. Her thoughts circled like carrion birds. Ghostfire had led her this far, had given her the drive, had told her Vector 1 was real, and now she was gone. Why? Had Tyr found them? Had Ghostfire been compromised? Or had she chosen to vanish just as she always had before Tess could depend on her? The question gnawed at her. But deeper still was a darker thought. What if Ghostfire hadn't left at all? What if Tess had been left to see what she would do without guidance? Another test, another cycle logged in some hidden file. Her stomach twisted. Every shadow looked like a camera lens, every silence like a microphone. And for the first time, Tess wondered if she would ever know where the program ended and her own choices began. She powered the drive one last time. Buried in its layers was a corrupted archive, almost lost to time. Tess dug through it, heartbeat steady, until one name surfaced again. Vector 1. And beneath it a location marker. Coordinates scrawled like graffiti, nothing polished, nothing official. She whispered the numbers aloud. They led south, out of the corridor, into the scarred cities long abandoned after the war. Her chest tightened. Vector 1 was alive, and she was still leaving signals. Tess closed the drive, slipped it back into her pocket and stood. Snow swirled hard across the roof. The storm howled like a warning. But Tess didn't move, didn't flinch. Because somewhere out there, in the ruins of a city no one wanted to remember, was the only person who might tell her what she truly was. And for the first time, Tess knew the question she had to ask when she found her. Was survival strength? Or refusal? The city looked like it had been carved from bone. Tess stepped through streets gutted by fire years ago, every building hollowed, every window socketed like a blind eye. Ash still clung to corners where the wind hadn't swept clean. The war hadn't just scarred this place, it had erased it. And maybe that was why Vector 1 had come here. No one searched cities, no one wanted to remember. Tess's boots crunched over glass. The silence pressed against her ears until she thought she might hear her own blood. Every shadow twitched like it carried memory. She moved carefully, her weapon low, her senses sharper than steel. The coordinates whispered by the drive had led her here. A tenement block leaning against itself, stairwell collapsed halfway, top floors open to the sky. Inside, the air was damp, cold, thick with mold and dust. Her flashlight beam cut through rubble and broken pipes. Then in the corner she saw it. A mark carved into plaster, crude, simple. V1. Her breath caught. Vector 1 had been here. She followed the trail through half-collapsed rooms, staircases cracked like broken ribs. More carvings, sometimes numbers, sometimes single words. None neat, all desperate. Remember. Not them. Fire. Her chest tightened with everyone. They weren't just warnings. They were proof. Proof that Vector 1 had lived here, walked these halls, refused to vanish quietly. In one room she found a rusted cot, a water canister long emptied, a pile of charred papers. She sifted through the ash with gloved hands until one fragment survived. 3 words again. Lux is lie. Tess closed her eyes. The room seemed to tilt. A lie. Everything she had been told about the program, about survival, about being chosen. All of it bent toward one truth she wasn't ready to hold. If Vector 1 had written this, it wasn't desperation. It was defiance. And if Lux was a lie, then what was Tess? By nightfall, she had made camp in the shell of an office tower, her fire no more than a handful of sparks hidden under broken tiles. The city's silence pressed heavy. broken only by the wind slipping through cracks like whispers. She turned the fragment of paper over in her hand. The words burned hotter than the fire. Lux is lie. Her mind churned. Ghostfire had told her she was Lux Vector 6, that she had been engineered, profiled, designed. Tess had believed it because the files said it, because Ghostfire's eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. But what if even Ghostfire had been misled? What if Lux wasn't a designation at all, but a trap? Her father's voice returned, trust the mission, not the people. But now she didn't know which was which. The next morning, she moved deeper into the ruins. In the basement of a collapsed clinic, she found more signs. A crude shelter built from doors, empty ration packs, a cracked lens from a comm device, and scratched into the wall a longer phrase. We are not vectors. Tess's throat closed. She whispered the words aloud. Not vectors, not numbers, not experiments, people. For the first time since the floodplain, her eyes stung. She pressed her forehead to the wall, breath trembling against the cold stone. Vector 1 hadn't been hiding just for herself. She had been fighting, carving reminders into forgotten places so anyone who came after might remember. Tess whispered, I see you. And for the first time, she meant it. It was dusk when she finally heard it. A sound small, subtle, too precise to be the wind. Footsteps. Her hand slid to her sidearm. Her body went still. The sound drew closer, measured, cautious. Then a voice, low, hoarse, fragile but unmistakably human. Put it down. Tess froze. She turned slowly, weapon still low but ready. A figure stepped from the shadows. Thin, ragged, hair matted, skin carved by years of exposure, eyes sharp, fever bright. The woman's voice cut through the silence. You followed the trail. Tess's chest tightened. Vector 1. The woman didn't deny it. Her gaze darted to Tess's sidearm. Drop it now. Tess hesitated, then let it fall to the dust. Her hands lifted. Vector 1 stepped closer. Up close she looked nothing like the file. Not a failed candidate, not a weapon, a survivor, a ghost who refused to fade. Her voice shook, not from weakness but from rage buried too long. You're one of them. Tess shook her head. Not anymore. Vector 1's eyes narrowed. There's no such thing as not anymore. Once they build you, you're theirs. Every move you make, every breath you take, they're waiting for it, watching. Tess's pulse pounded. I've seen the files, I know what they did. That's why I'm here, to find you. Vector 1's laugh was sharp, brittle. To finish me, you mean? No, Tess said quickly, to understand. The older woman studied her, eyes flicking like she could peel truth from flesh. You really don't know, do you? She whispered. Know what? Vector 1 stepped closer, so close Tess could see the dirt in the cracks of her skin, the scar that split her lip. They don't make vectors to survive, they make them to end. You're not the mission, Calhoun. You're the weapon they point when they want silence. The words hollowed her chest. I don't want to be that, Tess whispered. Vector 1's gaze softened only slightly, then don't. The silence between them stretched, heavy, fragile. Then Vector 1 leaned closer. But you'll have to choose fast, because if you found me, it means they already have. That night Tess sat across from her in the flicker of a stolen lantern. They shared dry rations, neither eating much. Vector 1 spoke sparingly, her voice rough with disuse. She told fragments, not stories, places she'd hidden, signals she'd scrambled, people she'd tried to warn before disappearing again. Tess listened, each word stitching into her like a scar. Finally, Vector 1 said, Ghostfire sent you, didn't she? Tess hesitated, yes. Vector 1's mouth tightened. Of course she did, still playing both sides, still pretending she can outthink the machine she built. She told me the truth, Tess said quietly. She told you a truth, Vector 1 snapped. Never confuse that with the whole. Tess felt the words sink deep. For the first time, she realized Ghostfire's silence. Her sudden disappearance might not have been protection. It might have been betrayal. At dawn, Tess rose to the sound of drones. Faint, distant, but growing closer. Her stomach turned. Vector 1 was already standing, her pack slung, her rifle loaded. They're here. Tess's heart hammered. They tracked me. Vector 1 shook her head. They tracked us. They always do. The older woman's gaze locked on hers. You want to stop being their weapon. Then this is your moment. We run or we fight, but if you go back, you'll never be free again. Tess's breath stuttered. Run, fight, betray, survive. Every option burned. And for the first time, Tess realized choice wasn't freedom. Choice was weight. And it was hers to carry. The drones sounded like thunder. Low at first, then sharper. A growing swarm, their rotors slicing the dawn air. Tess stood on the broken roof of the tenement, her pulse sinking with the mechanical hum. Beside her, Vector 1 loaded her rifle with quick, efficient hands. No fear, no hesitation. She had lived with pursuit so long that it had become another kind of weather. They'll box us in within minutes, Vector 1 said. Tess's chest tightened. Then we don't wait. The older woman glanced at her, measuring. You're not like them, I can see it, but you need to prove it to yourself, not me. The swarm broke through the clouds. Shadows rippled across the cracked pavement. Red sensors flared like eyes searching for confession. Tess lifted her weapon, her breath steadied. For once there was no hesitation. The first drone dropped fast, its searchlight carving through dust. Tess aimed, exhaled, fired. The crack split the silence and the machine spiraled into flame. Vector 1 took the second, a single precise shot through the rotors. Sparks scattered like fireflies across the dawn. But for everyone that fell, 3 more appeared. The swarm grew denser, closing their circle. Tess's ribs ached with every breath, not from strain but from clarity. She wasn't here by accident. She wasn't here because Ghostfire had led her, or because Whitlock had handed her a drive, or because Tyr had written her into a file. She was here because she had chosen to follow the trail. And choice, she realized, was the one thing they couldn't script. A missile ripped through the air. The explosion split the building beneath them. Tess staggered, concrete dust blinding her eyes. Vector 1 grabbed her arm, pulling her down a stairwell just as another strike tore the rooftop apart. They landed hard in the basement, the air thick with dust and static. Vector 1's voice was harsh, ragged. They won't stop until one of us is gone. Tess gritted her teeth. Then we make sure it isn't us. The older woman laughed bitterly. You still believe survival is victory. You'll learn. But there was no time for philosophy. The drones poured through broken windows, their beams cutting through the dark like knives. Tess reloaded, hands steady. Vector 1 raised her rifle. For a moment their eyes met, 2 survivors, 2 failures in the system's eyes, standing side by side. Then the basement erupted in fire and steel. The fight was brutal, not cinematic, not clean, just desperate. Rounds split the dark. Sparks showered across rubble. Tess's ears rang with each detonation, each scream of metal torn apart. She moved on instinct, ducking, firing, shifting cover. Every choice her own, every movement a refusal. When the last drone fell, the silence was deafening. Tess stood panting, her hands shaking. She forced them still. Vector 1 slumped against the wall, blood seeping through her jacket. No, Tess' breath dropping beside her. Stay with me. The older woman's eyes were glassy but sharp. Don't waste time. I can patch you, Tess said, already pulling a tourniquet from her pack. Vector 1's hand shot out, gripping Tess's wrist with surprising strength. Listen to me, she rasped. You're not Lux, you never were. That word, it was a cage, a name to make you believe you were theirs. Tess's throat closed. Then what am I? The older woman's gaze softened. You're free. As long as you keep choosing, remember that. Her grip loosened. Her breath slowed. Tess pressed the bandage harder, whispering, "Don't you quit on me." But some battles couldn't be won with steady hands. Vector 1's chest stilled. Silence pressed in, and Tess felt the weight of it settle into her bones. She buried the woman at dawn beneath the shattered beams of the clinic wall. No markers, no stones, just 3 words carved into the rubble, same as Vector 1 had once carved them into a bunk. We are not vectors. Tess stood in the silence long after, the wind tugging at her jacket, the sun bleeding pale across the horizon. Then she turned and walked. Not back to Tyr, not back to Ghostfire, not toward any order scribbled in a file, but forward into the ruins, into the unknown. Each step her own. Weeks blurred. She moved from one ghost city to another, following faint signals, scavenging supplies, listening to frequencies most people ignored. Sometimes she heard Tyr's chatter, hunting, searching, but she never answered. Other times she picked up whispers, survivors, people who had walked away from the machine, men and women who had left their units, their contracts, their cages. She didn't meet them, not yet, she wasn't ready. But she listened, and slowly she began to believe there were more. Months later, in another city gutted by silence, she sat on the roof of a half-collapsed tower, staring at the horizon. Her father's dog tags hung heavy against her chest. She rubbed them between her fingers, whispering the words he had taught her long ago. Never panic, assess, calibrate, deliver. But she added her own, softer, carved from scars. Never forget, never follow, choose. The wind carried the words away, but she didn't need them to return. She already knew. Somewhere Tyr was still searching, still staging their games, still measuring soldiers like test animals in a maze. Somewhere Ghostfire was still moving her pieces, still playing both sides, still believing she could outthink the system she had built. But Tess Calhoun no longer belonged to them. She wasn't their soldier. She wasn't their test subject. She wasn't their weapon. She was a reminder. That silence could resist. That survival could defy. That choice was the one thing they could never code, never measure, never steal. As the sun sank, the city lit with firelight where survivors had lit their hidden camps. Tess watched the sparks flicker one by one, fragile but stubborn, until the night itself seemed alive with quiet defiance. And she thought of Vector 1's last words. You're free as long as you keep choosing. Her jaw set, her heart steadied. And for the first time in her life, Tess Calhoun smiled. Because freedom wasn't loud. It wasn't written in files or carved into protocols. Sometimes freedom was a whisper, a refusal, a choice made in silence. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.